This will be recorded online, available tomorrow. But I would like to introduce Eric from RCS, who's going to be leading the PowerPoint presentation on the cost of services study. Just to give a little background, this was identified in the city's long-range financial recovery plan as a result of the audit we had in 2020, which identified that we needed to assess and update our fees. And so we did an RFP and selected RCS as our consultant, and they have gone through the process to develop this study. And I will turn it over to Eric now.
No, because there's 225 of them, I do believe. We can pull up a copy of the report as we're kind of going through. And so I do want to keep this informal. It's just us here. And so if you do have questions, raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone so the whole rest of the world can hear your question. But let's just kind of go through this. And it's good to be here. I'm Eric Johnson from RCS. I'm here with my partner, Rick Kermer. We both worked on this report together. And so just a little history about RCS. We were founded in 1980 by Rick, actually, and a couple other people. And since then, we've been the premier expert, we like to say, is in user fee, cost allocation, impact fee studies. We've been doing this for 43 years. I myself have been doing this for over 30 years, and this is what we do, working with cities, public agencies to help them identify their costs. All right, so this is a comprehensive study. We obviously looking at the user fees, mostly development fees, but also some police fees, fire fees, recreation fees. We looked at some rents, facility rentals, use of city property, and we reviewed the fines, municipal code violations, building code violations also. So what have we done? We've turned the city budget as to what it would look like if it were a business. And we did this because the voters told us to. They passed Proposition 13. Everyone remembers Proposition 13 in 1978. A year later, in 1979, they passed Proposition 4, which said that the cities can charge a fee for the cost reasonably borne of providing the service. That's not considered a tax, as long as you're not charging more than what those costs are. So that's what we did with this process. We had to really change the city budget from what it looks like from fund, department, division, and have it more of a service orientation. What are the services being provided? What are the costs of those services? Just like a business would do. I used the example at the council meeting, my favorite example, a can of corn. When you go to the grocery store and you buy a can of corn, that it includes the farmer, that it includes the trucker, that it includes the distribution, everything it took to get that can of corn to the store, and the people in the store, including the checker in front of you. You know that when you buy that can of corn. Well, we've done that same thing here with city services. All the costs are identified as what are the costs to provide that service to the public. So there's no city council service in here. There's no city manager service in here. They're part of the overhead, the admin overhead, just like a business would do. You're not charging a different fee for the Treasury Department and a different fee for accounts payable. It's all part of the overhead cost and part of the cost of the services that we've identified here. We also matched up revenues with those costs because, again, you won't stay in business very long if you can't match up the revenues that you're receiving as a business with the cost to provide that. And this was a thorough process. We looked at every city service that is being provided. We looked at what are the current fees that are being provided. We identified those areas where they could add some fees that they're not currently charging, that they're providing those services. We redefined certain fees because it's been a little bit of time since the last time this has been done and processes have changed, and so we changed the structure of some of the fees. We want to make sure they're legally defensible. As I mentioned before, you can't charge more than the cost reasonably borne of providing the service. And that's been defined over the years through court decisions in addition to some additional voter propositions. And so we've gone through and made sure that these are legally defensible fees. Want to make sure that the revenue is being collected under the current fees. And we're aware of market demand for certain fees, especially when we get into the recreation area. So what did we do? We needed to identify what are the services being provided. Went through that with each department, identified all the services being provided, And then allocated staff time to all those services. Who's providing the service? How much time does it take? How much time of their day are they spending? How many of these are you doing? We went through that process with staff over again and over again until we all felt comfortable that this time was accurate. And one of the things that helped with that is we allocated out 100% of everybody. So we're not just saying they spent an hour here and 2 hours there. That all adds up. How many of these are you doing? Well, we do 10 of those. Okay, that's 10 hours, or that's 20 hours. And we add up all that time so that we're looking at how much of a staff time are we allocating. And if it's over 100%, well, we've got a problem. We've got to go back and take another look at the data. If it's less than 100% of what we've allocated already, what else are they doing? So things like administrative support or tax-supported services, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, that you're providing directly to the public that you're never going to charge a fee for. Police and fire and streets and parks. So that's our starting point. What are the services being provided? Who's providing them? How much time does it take? We then needed to calculate the cost side. So for every position in the city, we developed a fully allocated hourly rate. Salaries, benefits, general operating expenses like supplies, office supplies and such, but also that overhead component. We did a cost allocation plan where for all the admin departments, we went through those departments and who are you providing services to? What services are you providing? And come up with allocation factors for each of those services we identified so that we're fairly allocating that overhead cost back to the departments who use it. They're their customers. So now then becomes part of the cost of a planner or a police officer or a firefighter. So we then match up that time detail with that cost detail, and now we know what the services cost. We sat down again with the departments, reviewed that information. Here's the current fee. Here's the cost. Here's what change we need to make to the fee to make sure we're recovering that cost, not more than that cost, certainly. And that's what we ended up here with the final report, are the result of those discussions with staff, the calculations that we did, and the recommendations that are in the report for each of the over 200 services that we identified. So again, we looked at all the services we're providing, and the way we kind of look at all the different services, tax services versus fee services, community-supported services versus personal choice services. Taxes pay for community-supported services. That's what taxes are for. Things that only taxes can pay for. And importantly, benefits the community as a whole. Police patrol, fire suppression, park maintenance, street maintenance, those things that you're not charging a fee for, you can't charge a fee for, and that's what taxes pay for. On the other side, what we call personal choice services, those things that you could charge a fee for. You don't have to. But customer is identifiable, service is measurable, and importantly, it benefits an individual or a group and not the larger community. You can still decide to subsidize these services. You just can't charge more than the cost. But the council can decide to charge less if they feel that certain services have a larger benefit to the community, even if it's not what we call a community-supported service. Recreation services are a good example of that. Through this report, we identified over $13 million in subsidy of those services that could be charged a fee that are not to the level of their cost. So if to the extent that the fee does not cover the cost of the service is being provided. The question now is who's going to pay for it. And if the fee payer is not paying for it, by definition, the taxpayer is paying for it. That's the only source of money that the city has. I do, and first I have a summary of that list. So 13 million there, you see the 13 million in the third column of numbers there. And so first column of numbers, total fee revenue. So under your current revenues, this is what is being provided. Total service cost, what are the cost of those services? And then the subsidy or profit in the column after that. Now, since the last meeting, we did make a couple changes to the recreation in the Sportsplex program that I'll go into more detail later. So it's that $13 million number is a little bit higher than it was at our last meeting. So overall, the city's recovering about 43% of the cost of these various fee services. Now it's that last column, about $1.4 million is what we think that if all the recommendations in this report were acted on, that's what we think the city can recover. Not 13 million, 1.4. That's a big difference. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. There are some services in here that, even though we've defined them as personal choice services, they're not going to come close to recovering all of their cost. Police false alarm, fire false alarm. The whole goal of the program is to get people to fix their alarms. So the first 3 calls are free. Well, most of the calls are the first 3 calls. But we still have that cost in there, and it's a big cost and a big subsidy that's not going to go away. Recreation programs. That'll be a whole discussion, we hope, with the community about what subsidy level should there be for community services programs, because there will be. You're not going to charge full cost for the various different recreation programs you're providing because people won't pay it. You have to be aware of the market and live within that. So those are the 2 biggest reasons why we have that big $13 million number and the $1.3 million number. Oh, the other one is EMS. EMS services, even though there's fees in here for that, and we're recommending increases to those fees, you're still not going to come anywhere close to recovering 100% of the cost. And that's just the nature of the program. If you'd be charging $10,000 for a paramedic call, which obviously is not going to happen. When we're done with this little PowerPoint here, we can pull up a couple of places in the report that gets into more detail. Because the report itself has about 40 pages of text, explanatory text and summary tables. And it'll be those summary tables that I think you'll be looking at. On chapter 3, pages 23 to 33, there's tables for each of those subgroups there: community development, public safety, community services, and administrative services. There'll be these summary tables that for each service identifies what's the current revenue, what's the cost, what's the subsidy, what's the possible new revenue. And then for each of those, say it'll have that S number off to the left there, S001, S002. For every one of those, there'll be more detail in Appendix A of the report, which is after the text, after the first 40 pages. If you pull up the PDF, there'll be bookmarks that'll take you right to Appendix A or right to Appendix B. So Appendix A, for every of these services, each of those S numbers, what's the current fee, what's the proposed fee? So you can see side by side what is the city currently charging and what could they charge. And then if you want to get into more detail, for each of those S numbers in Appendix B, there'll be these 2 matching pages. And on the left-hand side will be a description of the service, what the current fee is, a revenue and cost comparison, and a recommended fee. And on the right-hand side, it'll show the cost detail. It'll show all the positions that are involved, how much time they're involved, the fully allocated cost on a per-unit basis and a total or annual basis. So for every service, you can say, okay, why is this service costing us $5,000? You can get into it and, okay, we got a planner spending 20 hours on this, engineer spending 5 hours on that, and so it has that level of detail that you can really dive into and hopefully ask more questions. Appendix C, recreation summary. It lists the recreation services, but with recreation, we want to look at it a little differently. We still identify the full cost just like we do with every other service. But for recreation services, we want to take a step back. What is it we care about here? What we care about, I think, is how much each of these programs is recovering and how much, as a community, we want them to recover. And so we take a look at the direct cost, and so that detail that's listed there is the direct cost. And so you can see what part-time staff are involved, what full-time staff are involved. Compare that to the revenues and have a direct cost recovery. And so my goal is to ask the council to what should be the cost recovery for these different programs, the direct cost recovery, and set some cost recovery goals. So instead of saying that this program should charge $100, this should charge $50, set a goal and then let the recreation professionals who know the market, know recreation programs, set fees within that goal. If the council says we want to recover 50% of our direct costs for youth programs. Well, then they should set fees that meet that goal, that don't exceed that goal. And if you set it based on direct cost, it allows them to come back more easily on an annual basis to the council and show how they have met the goal or how they haven't, because they know what their direct costs are. If we have to add in overhead cost and maintenance cost, it becomes a much more complicated exercise. So it's trying to have the council set a goal and make it easy for staff to tell council how they're achieving that goal or not. And that's at the very back of the report, Appendix C. So our goal was to identify what are all the full cost of the various services that the city is providing. We've made fee recommendations for every service that we feel could be charged a fee, or is charged a fee, or could be charged a fee. It's now up to the city council or the community to decide which of these services should be charged the full cost and which should be subsidized with tax dollars. Because services are occurring. Costs are happening. Question now is who's going to pay for it. If the fee doesn't cover the cost, the taxpayer is paying for it, and you have less money for things like police and fire and streets and parks. And that is it.
One thing I do want to point out is that the fee schedule is available online. There's a banner on the homepage, which takes you to the fee schedule page, which has the cost of services study and our existing schedules there. And then you can pull up the PDF.
My name is Robinson, and I've lived in West Covina a long time. And budget crunch is an old story here. I mean, it goes back at least 30 years. And the city of West Covina used to own water rights, and whenever there's a crunch, they have a yard sale and sell off whatever they have that's valuable. Well, water rights are more valuable than gold, and the city should have never gotten rid of it. The water companies were eager to pick that little jewel up. But, this is a decades-old story, and I don't think the taxpayers in West Covina that pay for police and fire services are going to want to cut much there. Probably none. Because we're in the days of COVID, and I'm an old guy, but the cold and flu season has come every winter of my whole life, but now that we don't talk about colds and flu, we talk about COVID instead. And we're coming up on another round, and we've seen this story before. And the reason I mention that is because it's going to put a lot of burden on the police and fire departments, so their needs are going to accelerate. And there's none of the voters in West Covina want to cut police and fire in the face of what's going to happen. So that leaves recreational services, and that was on the left, and it was services that provide where there's a choice. So that's why I want to focus on that. Big League Dreams has been talked about, and it's a big financial burden on the city, but not very many people, not many residents benefit from it. And just like we sold our water rights many years ago, that was an asset that we shouldn't have sold. Well, Big League Dreams is a West Covina asset, and it's located pretty close to the city of industry, and maybe we could sucker the the City of Industry, because their budget is, they have no residents and a huge budget surplus. Maybe we could sucker them into becoming a co-owner of Big League Dreams. I mean, they could buy 51% of Big League Dreams, and that would take a lot of the burden away from West Covina. And then we could be co-owners. The City of West Covina and the City of Industry could be co-owners of Big League Dreams, and that would get at least half of the white elephant off of our back, because I guess the City of Industry needs recreational services and softball fields as much as we do. So I'm not very well prepared because I haven't seen the 400-page report, but between now and our next meeting, I want to look at it. But just off the top of my head, I'd like, appraise it and see. It's just like we sold valuable water rights, which we shouldn't have. West Covina should still own those, and it's the same old story. Because I don't see especially in face of what we're going to be facing in the next 5 years, there's just no possible way to cut anything from the police and fire. In fact, it'll probably be the opposite. Police and fire are going to go through the roof because of public health problems. Our public health is declining. So off the top of my head, that's my best idea is knock on the City of Industry's door and try to sell them as much of that asset as we could unload.
Great, thank you.
Good evening. Jerry Patras, West Covina resident. I'm also a retired community college administrator. I'm probably more conflicted over this than I realized I would be. My professional beliefs are in line with what you're doing. Me being a resident in this city, I see inconsistencies with the way that current fees are imposed on people. They cherry pick what they're going to do. The politics drive it. Where I'm used to politics, I dealt with it. One example, as you're talking about this, that just brought it back to me. A couple of years ago, during the holidays, there's various resident houses that do craft shows, and they'll have homemade jams and jellies and pastries and stuff, and it's wonderful, and we enjoy it. One of them that is really popular, I go to, and the city shut it down, or code did, because they didn't have the proper permits. But they will not put, the pushcart vendors are supposed to have a county health sticker on it, but they don't enforce that. And their fees that the pushcarts do are nominal fees, and that's, I understand from people, those individuals that do the pushcarts, they're actually working for a larger company. At least that's what several residents that are knowledgeable have told me. So for me to watch or live in a city that cherry picks a residents doing something that we really like out of their house, and they had to stop selling their baked goods. But daily we have people selling food without a health permit. That's inconsistent, and that bothers me big time. Our fire department has a lot of, and police department, they have fees. I did look at the pages, okay? I couldn't regurgitate it back, but I did. And the fire department, the finance director, and some of us have had little discussions. All the city does is monitor them. So we're going to increase their fees so they get more money so they can just keep spending more and more and more and more. And nobody in the city council or the staff will ask them, I'm going to say ask them to stay within their budget. I pay for this stuff. You pay for it. You pay for it. We do not see any controls effective controls on by our council anymore. Previous ones did. So for me, while I professionally think, and have always thought when I was working too, the public sector messes up a bit by not raising fees small amounts more frequently. We go until we're really subsidizing with our general fund, and then we kick in a fee thing, and everybody gets upset, and we either back off or we don't do enough. So I do think your report was good. Okay? I'm highly concerned about our city council and staff implementing this. So that's my initial reaction.
Okay, thank you.
I haven't read the full 400 pages, and I kind of
It's great nighttime reading.
I concentrated on the community development services. One thing which I understand, it's not just the planning department, but I guess you also include engineering and public works. Now, I do know with each one of those areas, there are certain documents that the city is asked to produce. For example, with planning, it's their general plan document. Now, the fee for having something like that prepared, which staff normally doesn't have the bodies nor maybe the expertise to do in-house, are those items covered under the development impact fee?
For those things that just general maintenance and general updates of the general plan, those are things that are more paid for out of taxes that we call advanced planning. For a developer coming and wanting to do a general plan amendment where the developer's asking for it, that is something that we have a fee for in here to cover those costs, and should be designed in a way to cover the contract cost also, to make sure that we're getting all those. So shouldn't be using development impact fees for any of that. That should all be for infrastructure and the related to that, and not for the operational processes, day-to-day processes. Oh, the general plan maintenance charge. We did add a general plan maintenance charge where it covers some of the cost. That is a surcharge on ongoing development to help to cover some of that cost when you do update the general plan.
Right, because just like one of the elements in the general plan is the housing element. Normally the general plan, if cities have the money, they try to update that every 10 years.
Right.
The last time West Covina overhauled theirs was in 2016.
So they're coming up.
So time rolls around.
It does. It does.
And I guess what I was gathering in looking at the services, that you're trying to at least have a certain portion of the service cost being done, if you can, under some type of a permit or a fee, taking off so that it doesn't have to be subsidized by the general fund.
Right. Everything that it's applicant-driven, developer-driven, not just part of the regular city business that, let's say, the city council has a policy change and there's a general plan amendment that comes out of that. That's something that's paid for by the city, by the taxpayer. But if I'm a developer, if I have this project, whatever that project is, it can be a conditional use permit that a business wants, or a tentative map if someone's trying to subdivide their property. That has current fees, but we're saying that those current fees don't cover the cost because it's been a long time since it's been studied and reviewed and updated. So if you're just doing CPI increases, it generally doesn't keep up. And so those are the things that we're recommending in here, that the city council adjust the fees to recover 100% of the costs that we've identified.
Now, are you also, as part of the report, suggesting that the city also have a plan if it's every 3 years or every 4 years, going back and looking at the fees?
Yeah, it's not something we put in the report. It's certainly something we recommend. We've talked with the city about it. It should, every 3 to 5 years is something that the city should be doing a review of their fees, in addition to the CPI increases in between.
On a positive note, you have a policy regarding new services. That paragraph I thought was very good, and it really should be done. I'm skeptical that the current council and staff would do it, but I would encourage them. It's on page 33. That I would really encourage that they take that seriously because it's needed. And what it is that the City Council adopt a policy of not starting any new service without a cost analysis, using the costing approach utilized in this report, so as to determine ways in which the service could be fee financed if at all possible. I think that's a good idea.
It's a lot of it's changing mindset, of the community, of the council, of, everyone wants to provide services. That's why we're here. That's why cities exist. But at some point, who's benefiting from it? Who's paying for it?
What I found after I retired, and it was really an eye-opener to me, community colleges have to stay within their budgets, so we have to be self-supporting, or we just use our general funds up. The city doesn't have that, and so they just spend. And we're not seeing the analysis we used to see before, and I'd like to see them get back to that. And I think if this was an opening door to doing cost analysis, I could support it. What people don't oftentimes realize is we, the residents, are paying these fees. The builder just tacks it onto our bill if you're adding on. It's passed on.
Well, that's not necessarily true. When you buy a house, the market determines the price of that house. Right. And at a certain point, if the developer feels he can't make enough money, he just won't build the house.
But if I want to add a room on, which when I bought this house I did, I'm the one that's actually going to pay those fees to the contractor.
Oh, right, yeah. If you're adding onto your own house, yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So we as residents should be concerned about how much the city's fees are.
Sure.
Because, it's beyond just the dog permit license type of thing.
Yep. Let me check over there first. Anybody got anything over here?
On the subject to continue on the subject of new services, California has 58 counties and 58 health departments, and Pasadena and Long Beach, I guess, have their own health departments. And there's been talk in the last 3 or 4 years to perhaps have public health services in West Covina, and they would have to be paid for. And I think there's probably less than a dozen residents in West Covina that think there should be a West Covina Health Department. The rest of them are on the other side or neutral. So I wanted to mention that perhaps on the subject of new services, we don't need to be a city health department. And could you help me out? I've lived here for a long time, but I understand that the city's divided up into 9 departments. Could you name those 9?
Let's see if I can. It's a little bit different here. Every city kind of does it a little bit different. Police and fire, public services, not public works, community services. And I'm not sure how the admin departments are broken up. It's usually city manager, city clerk.
Yeah, well, police and fire, I think, are 3 of the 9. And I don't want to talk about those, but the other 6.
Well, there's the administrative departments: city manager, human resources, city clerk. Mostly don't provide services to the public, but provide support to the rest of the organization. So kind of take those off. So you're kind of public works, public services, maintenance, and the community services, recreation. So those are the 2 programs that are typically tax supported. Although there are fee services and fee programs in community services, it's just a question of how much is it going to be subsidized versus saying it's 100% cost recovery.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it looks like community services and recreational services are the ones that maybe a majority of the public would be willing to, if we have to save money and impose fees, those might be the candidates, because it seems like the police and fire and public safety is kind of off limits. So we just have to deal with what we have left. What?
Development service.
Yeah, well, isn't the city of West Covina pretty much built out? I've been hearing for years that it's... Yeah.
They're staying busy. They're processing applications. Development's happening. It may not be the big tracks like it used to be. But there's still a lot of development, and just as a region, we're getting denser.
Yeah.
Getting taller, and that's going to be, I live in Brea, so this is just something that this region is going to change in that way. And so that means ongoing development.
Well, and then you have to ask the West Covina residents whether they want to live in a beehive or not. And maybe the majority of residents don't want that. So to the extent that West Covina can be considered built out, maybe redevelopment could be alongside community services and recreational services. I mean, I think we sold off our water rights years ago, which we shouldn't have. But gosh, I mean, if we could just sell big league dreams to the city of industry. I mean, the city of industry's got a big tax. They have no residents and a big budget, so they could afford it. I mean, we could, put on our salesman's hat and see if we can get rid of most of our white elephants, and we could be co-owners, West Covina and the city of industry, of big league dreams. That's. But the city of health department, in the category of new services, I can't see the residents wanting to support that with their fees or taxes or anything.
So this report did not include the health department nor any evaluation of its fees. The city is currently in a holding pattern for that at the time in which we are given direction as to what programs we might be even able to apply for the opportunity to serve the community. There would be an assessment done, and those would be evaluated at that time.
Well, if you're in a holding pattern, that's fine. You don't need to put it on the ballot, and the residents would happily vote for the whole idea. Then you can dismiss the whole subject. Put it before the voters.
Again, that's not included in this fee study, which we're talking about tonight.
The recreation, Bill had mentioned like recreational fees. It's my community college background, I think. We had to make our programs self-supporting. And so if you were a community services teacher of a non-credit class, you actually had to make sure that class paid for itself. I think that's a reasonable request level for certain things, is that they be self-supporting. One of the things that does concern me is, like, we have the ambulance service for the fire department. Somebody recently just got a $1,000 bill for the ambulance. In the past, the city would include those types of services in the West Covina Discover magazine, and they're not doing that. So if the city goes to increase fees and does certain other types of subscription services, but they are ineffective at keeping the residents informed, and I do think they are ineffective at keeping them informed. We talk a lot, but we're not dialoguing of what's really effective. I would like to see every time there's an issue, at least one page explaining something about dog licenses, something about the ambulance subscription fee, something about the false alarm fee. There are ways we can educate people where they don't pay the fees because they're educated and they know how to legally avoid the fee. That's my last 2 cents.
That's noted and will be passed on to the department that puts together the Discover.
Good evening. My name is Jefferson DeRue. I want to apologize if I'm causing you to repeat information because I did arrive late. My question is, in this report, does it consist of a comparison of fees from other cities? And if so, where do we fall in that scale?
It does not. The way we look at it is, what are the services being provided here? How much does it cost here? And set your fees based on that cost recovery. When you're getting into the development fee area, Whether someone charges even $5,000 more than another city, that doesn't move the needle. That doesn't cause somebody to go, oh, I'm going to go to Covina because there I can pay $5,000 less when I open my business and get my CUP. They want to be here in West Covina in a particular place because that's where they want to be, or that's the property they own. So we've found that, and there's been numerous studies over the years that it doesn't move the needle. Developers want you to think it does, because what it cuts into is their profit margin. I'm talking more at professional developers, and whether they decide to build or not. But it doesn't get to that level. When you get to more capital impact fees, which are bigger dollar amounts, that moves the needle a little bit more. And you can have that kind of discussion when it comes to those fees. But a conditional use permit, tentative parcel map, those kinds of things, it doesn't matter what this city's charging or what that city's charging. It doesn't slow down development in your city because you're recovering your costs.
I agree with what you're saying. However, like Ms. Potras mentioned earlier, I'm looking at it more where the rubber meets the road, the residents. Mm-hmm. For example, I had my roof done, and the roofer that did it, he said, the fees over in this other city are less than the ones that you're being charged here. So I inquired as to why, and it's the method that's used. Though they're equally in terms of what the job was, but the fee was considerably higher in West Covina than his prior experience, that is the roofer. So when it comes to the residents, though, it may not impact the developer because there's a lot of money that they're playing with, and they can probably regain their investments, as also indicated by passing it or including it in the sales. For residents that have to deal with it on need basis, it's something that should strongly be considered.
Yeah, it's definitely. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, because there are certain fees, and oftentimes trying to dive in, why is it different? Usually, it's because that other city hasn't updated their fees in a number of years. Is usually the reason why when there's a big difference between one city and another. But sometimes it's a different process. Sometimes one city may be doing it a different way than another city. But it's usually just because one city hasn't kept up on it. Or in rare cases, I've seen roofing permits that have been subsidized because it's something that hits residents more directly. It's pretty rare, but it has happened. Oftentimes we'll see more water heater permits being subsidized because at a certain level, those kinds of things, you got to keep an idea of where your costs are and what the residents are willing to pay, because you have a lot more weekend work where people just don't pay the permits if your fees are not at a level that's appropriate.
One of the other concerns I have is the timing of this. People's pocketbooks are really hurting right now, and so if this gets just... I'm also a bit concerned the council will cherry pick which fees to increase, which ones not to, which ones to ignore because they don't want... We've seen some of that happen where a council spent quite a considerable amount of time on the false alarm fees, and they adopted something, and then when a council member got caught up in that, it got suspended, and I don't like seeing that. But I do think some of the fees right now at this time could hurt some people's pocketbooks, especially people on fixed incomes. I like to see them at the seniors. I don't go to the senior center, but I like the fact that it's there and it's very popular, and the youth programs are very popular and stuff. There's a reality, and I know I've been in the council chambers when they talked about raising fees on youth groups, and you just fill up the council chambers because they don't want the fees. So that's one of those things that we just need to get realistic. Then we subsidize, because you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, it's I like to encourage the council to go into it with thinking 100% cost recovery, and then which fees do we want to subsidize? Which fees are important enough for whatever reason that we want to subsidize? And just have that conversation with the community. These are the reasons why. That's great. That's what this whole process is about. Exactly. Yep, absolutely.
With this particular service report, did the city of West Covina have any agencies that are providing services to the residents that are actually contracted?
Many. Building and safety, engineering services are mostly contract. Those are the two that come to mind. Can't think of any big ones off the top of my head. Other than those are two big ones.
Sometimes with cities, when you think about Prop 13, when that was passed in 1978, the way that property taxes were done was done different. And as a result, that's limited to the 1%. And 1%.
You go up 2% a year.
Yeah. But, and even with that happening, there was a change in the sizes of various cities, from the Inland Empire to Los Angeles. There were changes made, and I think to the most part, perhaps homeowners thought when they bought their home, they didn't need to worry about the street lighting, but the services has to be paid for to Edison. And then when you get into water and other public utilities, not all cities own the different utility companies. So like homeowners, they end up having to pay bills too. I guess what I'm saying is, when you say fee for service, as we know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's going to be some type of cost. But also for a city, there are certain amenities, certain qualities that you want to have. West Covina isn't any different than the other cities in San Gabriel Valley. This particular area, they don't have enough park area based on the population. And we know that outdoor area, it does provide a nice quality, and those are things that people will look at when they choose to move and live in a community, or if they choose to work in a community. And even businesses will look at that as well.
And that's where, when the development impact fees come back to the council, those are the kinds of things that build up amenities by having streets that can handle the flow of traffic and having parks. And it's those kinds of things that should be part of the discussion when you're talking about what do we want to charge for capital impact fees.
I know what you said. When we start seeing these new developments come in, there's really no common area in those things. There's a postage stamp little park, green grass. The one near where I live, they said, well, there's a park a couple blocks down. Yeah, Palmview Park is so used. It's just a small park that's popular, and we're just going to have more and more people. We need more park stuff, recreational areas. So I can see some of the subsidies, because that makes a better community and a happier community.
But you also want your kids to be able to live in the city. Think about the newer developments that we have. Right. If you'll notice some of the renderings that the architects have shown, do you see kids, or do you see just a woman and a man? Right. And are they happen to be of a certain age?
Okay, I guess that's my turn. And maybe I'm missing it here tonight because I came in late. I'm not trying to use that as an excuse, but is these fees considerations, is it with regards to it being supplemented by the general funds? Is that the focus of the fee study? Or are the fees across the board, or certain fees, being considered to be increased as a need due to inflation or what have you? And if the latter, in the past, City Council has taken into consideration the comparison of fees in other cities. So I'm kind of surprised that it's not included in this report, because, when it came to the fire department and alarms, these very fees that are in question tonight, just in general, fees. The previous council took that into consideration, and there was a comparison chart put out for the residents to see then as well. So for it to be missing now, I guess I'm losing what exactly the purpose of tonight and subsequent meetings is.
Sure. The purpose of this report and of this process is to identify the cost. You notice the title of the report is a cost of services report. And so we want to identify what the costs are. And then as part of that, we identify here are the services that you are charging a fee for or you could charge a fee for. And when we look at those costs, how does that compare to what you're currently charging? Okay, if there's a subsidy, then here's a recommendation to recover those costs. So that's about general fund recovery, because these are general fund departments that are providing these services. And so that's about general fund recovery. Who's going to pay for the service is the question we're asking. Costs are occurring. Who's going to pay for it? Taxpayer or the fee payer? Because that's your only two choices. And right now, it's for most of these fee services, it's a mix of the two because the fees don't cover the cost. And so that's what we're doing with this process. The fee comparison, certainly we can, if the council directs us to, we can work with staff and develop some, if there's certain targeted fees they want to look at, we can work with staff on that. You said the department heads are working on a fee comparison? Okay, no. Okay. But just saying here's the cost, but again, if there's certain fees that they want to look at, we can certainly work with staff on that. As I talked at the council meeting a week or so ago, when it comes to the development area, roof permits are one thing, but when it comes to development generally, to build a house or to build a strip mall or to look at what is a cost, what does another city charge for a conditional use permit? Every city defines it differently. So we can't just look at those individual ones. But when we have looked at from start to finish, what does it cost to build this or to build this? Even then, we run into issues because what are the services that city requires? Well, if we haven't worked in that city, we don't necessarily know, so we're kind of guessing because they really define things differently. Every city has different ways of defining their list of services, which I love because it keeps me interested. And then some cities charge deposits. Well, we don't know what that applicant paid at the end of the day off that $2,000 deposit. And so when we have done these fee comparisons on the development side, it really hasn't provided a lot of good information to be able to act upon because of all these different things. And then also, if I mentioned earlier about those cities that just haven't updated their fees in 10 years or 20 years, do you really want to match them? You want to make sure it doesn't become a race to the bottom for fees. So that's why I asked the council to think about it in terms of cost recovery. Who's going to pay for it? And they have more than enough power to subsidize any of it or all of it, but those comes with consequences. Those comes with opportunities lost because now you don't have that money that you can spend on other things.
And I understand what you're saying, but I guess what I'm thinking about is the studies that have been done have almost consistently shown that other cities' fees are higher than ours. It's kind of been used as a justification for the increase. So I'm not convinced that would be the scenario, that we would be, racing to the bottom in this case. But I also think that the study, I'm not sure why it hasn't been included. There was a belief that it was going to be included.
We don't do comparisons with our studies and never have. When there have been studies, comparisons associated with our studies, it's usually something that we'll work with staff separately, but we really push back on doing comparisons.
I turned it off.
Like JD, I too am very aware of those comparisons. And as you're talking, I keep seeing the fire chief. And he's always Beverly Hills, Beverly Hills, Beverly Hills is the city that keeps popping up, and they have more than we do. I think I think it's a real thing. I don't want to see it. I actually like it, the cost of each city, because each city's costs are going to be different. I think this is a better approach. I would like to see what JD's mentioned stop.
Well, and also this is the more legal approach. You can use comparisons to determine what you set your fees at, but you can't charge more than what your costs are. So everything has to start with what are your costs, and then you can go from there.
Well, I think a cost comparison among cities is a healthy project. A previous recent West Covina City Council eliminated the code enforcement department. I call them the trash can police. And, you know, all these departments have priorities. And right now, to my mind, police and fire are the top of the list, the high priorities public safety departments. And, you know, I don't want to live in a beehive. When I moved to West Covina, it wasn't a beehive, and it looks like the development, community development is going to turn us into a beehive. And I didn't move into one, and I kind of don't want to see it happen, but it looks like it's going to happen anyway. But I started out with code enforcement, and the fact that a recent previous council eliminated the whole department because, you know, having a trash can police force isn't as important as the other departments, and there should be a comparison among cities to see how much I assume the other council eliminated code enforcement because it cost more than the revenue that it produced. And then a recent council reinstated that. And maybe the reinstatement, a cost comparison could highlight that subject and see if it's worth it or not. And that's why I think a cost comparison, especially among the code enforcement department, might be a useful exercise.
And a cost comparison is even a harder thing to do. Years ago, Rick and I did a benchmarking study with some cities in South Carolina where they were benchmarking their solid waste services. And it was a huge undertaking, just something simple like solid waste, picking up trash. That should be the same every place you go. And it was great that they were doing it. It was great for them to look at what are kind of best practices. But even something simple like that was a big undertaking by city staff in those cities back then.
Yeah, well, we have an evergreen contract. We can't fix that. That's all.
Anything else? Yeah.
Okay, so I do appreciate you kind of bringing me up to date, at least to give me an understanding of what the meeting tonight is about, because I was in the dark there. But in terms of cost, you mentioned the cost, very important factor. That's the cost of the processing of the requests made by the developer or the resident, correct? And we recently here had a contract for service from the fire department where the contract couldn't be fulfilled by one of the contracted parties. So it would, when they were too busy, it would be passed on to a second. And it seemed, if my recollection serves me, the fees fluctuated in that situation. So the cost obviously changed. The cost factor there changed because of going from one contractor to another subcontractor. If that is possible, then these fees are kind of fluid to accommodate the cost.
Could be. It depends how the fee is worded. If it's a flat fee, you're stuck with it. If the fee is $500 per application, that's what the fee is. But many fees, especially in the development area, are deposit-based fees, where the applicant puts down a deposit and actual costs are charged against that. So if it's that kind of fee and the costs change, then what gets passed through to the applicant changes also. Anything else? Can you pull up the PowerPoint? As we leave here today, I want to again walk through, what did I do with that? There it is. Walk through how to read the report. And so again, I would focus on Chapter 3, those summary schedules. Notice that column 5, total profit subsidy. If it's a negative number, it's currently being subsidized. If it's a positive number, it currently has a profit, and the fees need to go down. And so, same way with the possible new revenue. If it's a positive number, that means that's what we think is new revenue. That's because of a fee increase. If it's a negative number, that means because you're over-recovering, and we're recommending a fee decrease. So kind of look at those two columns, but especially the possible new revenue, big numbers there, up or down, are maybe things you might want to look at a little bit more. And as you look at it a little bit more, you follow the S numbers from Chapter 3 in the text to Appendix A. Find that S number that you had a question about. What is the fee going to? What is the fee now? What is it going to? If you have a question about why is it going to that, that's where you go to Appendix B, find that same S number, and there you'll see the cost detail and who's involved and why that cost is what it is. So that's the best way to read the report. And again, Appendix C at the very back has a breakdown of the direct cost of the various different recreation programs and shows the current cost recovery from those direct costs. Now, this is different. This is one we're kind of looking at it different. We're pulling it back. And I'm not putting a subsidy number up there. I'm just saying, what's the cost recovery? You can do the math, and the total cost minus the total revenues is the subsidy, but we don't have it on here. Good. And so this is where things are currently at, the cost recovery for the different programs as they currently are. The overhead costs are not included in that calculation. They're down at the bottom there, as well as the maintenance costs. They still exist. We still calculated them. But with the exercise with recreation, trying to think about what's the cost recovery for direct cost, and what do we feel as a community should be the direct cost recovery for these various different programs? Because it's very difficult for most of these, if not all of these, to be 100% cost recovery, just because they got to work within the market, and there's going to be certain things like youth programs that the community wants to subsidize. So that's your homework. The summary of in the text, yeah, in the text there's a summary, and there's a summary kind of broken out by development services, public safety, recreation, and admin. You're minus just like everybody else. And that's where we talked about that $13 million minus number. That's the amount currently being subsidized. But if every recommendation in this report is followed, we think that the city can get $1.4 million a year. Not $13 million, 1.4, because there's certain things in there that are going to be subsidized. EMS programs, false alarm programs, recreation programs, that code enforcement programs, those things that are listed as one of those services in here, but we're not recommending much revenue recovery, cost recovery, because of the nature of the program.
Where's the recreation in that?
In the community services, the third line down.
Third line down.
Yeah.
The overcharge of fees is not.
There's a number of them in there, but there's not a lot of big dollar decreases. All right. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate you taking the time to come out today, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
Yes.